Hello and welcome to Sòrò, sókè, a podcast created to learn, understand, and demystify life in Africa and African lives. Today, I have on someone that I've honestly been following for a while, just like being super inspired about your work and what you've been doing, what you've been accomplishing. So honestly, super proud. Today we have on Jermaine, the founder of Kwanda.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So, as you mentioned, Jermaine is the name Jermaine Craig, and I founded Kwanda, which essentially is a platform that brings diasporans together to fund grassroots organizations and change makers across the African continent.
Okay, so already that sounds super interesting and insightful. So, just from that, right? Today we're obviously going to talk about kind of long-term investing and the impact on philanthropy on the continent and what it means to either give back, quote unquote, or kind of what it means to build something in your continent, diaspora. So yeah, in the first episode of Sòrò, sókè, we spoke about like the impact of being from the Black diaspora and often why people move, and we also spoke about kind of like what can people do to help or support people back in Africa or just like the African lives. So I think that's kind of like what Kwanda's trying to really tackle and work on. So what is the dream for Kwanda?
Yeah, so the dream long term is to have one of the largest funds in the world, and that is philanthropic fund, scientific fund, investment fund. And for that fund to be seeded by the African diaspora, and that's including the Caribbean diaspora as well, and ultimately for that fund to be invested in Africans globally. And so the reason for this is, I believe we need a reliable source of funding for the ideas that we have, both in the diaspora and on the continent. And I also believe in order for that fund and those investments to be inclusive of Africans, it needs to be seeded by Africans. And so at Kwanda, we're basically creating a platform and a vehicle that allows us to get to that end.
So you said reliable kind of like source of funding, which is really interesting point. Which kind of goes on to like, okay, so someone's listening to this and they're thinking, we already have kind of like charity aid funding organization. Why some people might ask why is Kwanda reliable rather than a traditional source of funding or charitable giving?
So there are two main reasons. One is technical and one is more just the human nature of things. So I'll start with the technical reason, which is our means of fundraising is through collectivity and through individuals. So rather than having a single funder or a single backer that gives us millions and says, hey, go and deploy this cash to this effect. And if we determine you're not doing it in the way that aligns with us anymore, that funding is pulled. We actually have, hundreds of people and soon to be thousands and tens of thousands of people contributing small amounts. And so that means we can be sustainable. And at any given moment, only one or two people are going to drop off, but there's no risk of the entire fund being pulled for any reason. So that's the more technical reason for the reliability. And the other reason is just that Africans are always going to be interested in investing in Africans. There's never going to be a time where one particular cause draws them away. And so, in that sense, it's also reliable. I think if we talk about traditional NGOs and larger charities, when we see the war in Ukraine, for example, immediately a lot of funds got redirected in that direction. And that might be because the stakeholders more resonate with the issues going on in Ukraine than they do with the issues going on in Africa. And so by having a fund that's seeded by Africans, we'll never be at risk at that of like African issues not resonating.
Okay. Okay. So, say larger NGOs, like you've mentioned, if there's like a humanitarian issue or, some type of war going on or conflict, they would, like you said, kind of like move the money around or like to persuade people to donate to the certain donation, they will use images to show kind of like the destruction or the impact. But I've noticed that Kwanda doesn't necessarily use images of the traditional images of children malnourished with bloated bellies and mosquitoes on their head, kind of like to get
Yeah.
them to donate. Or so I think my first question is like, what's your strategy on getting people to donate or getting people to sign up?
Yeah, sure. So there are, of course, with anything, there are a few different
Hmm.
strategies. So the kind of overarching strategy and long-term strategy is one of just narrative change. It's
Hmm.
to get people to focus more on innovation and building and growth rather than, poverty and destitution. Because we do feel like by focusing on innovation and building and change making, you get to the same end anyway, where you can eradicate poverty. So why, and so maybe there's a sense with larger NGOs that you get more return on your marketing dollars by focusing on the poverty. That decision is made in such a simple way is because ultimately the stakeholders that are making that decision don't have any stake in the negative outcomes of that decision, which is the negative portrayal that's then tagged on Africans in the diaspora. So in terms of why what we're doing to get people to sign up and join without using some of these like more traditional means is focused on complete transparency. So on our platform we offer complete financial transparency, and so everything from the amount of cash we have in the bank at any given moment to the amount of donations we have coming in monthly from our members to the fixed costs that allow us to run the organization is transparent and updated in real time. Similarly, our banking transactions, so each line of banking transactions, whether we pay for office space or whatever it might be, is updated in real time and connected to our bookkeeping. So that's one thing we use to kind of encourage people to join. A second element is our actual projects are tracked real time as well. And so rather than us like produce an impact report at the end of the year and say, hey, we affected 1,000 people here and we did this, you can actually just go onto the individual projects we're running and have a live update of how things are going. In some projects, it might be day to day or week to week. In some projects we've had, it's even hour to hour where it feels like you go to the place with the team that's executing on that project and you see how the day plays out. So those are two things that we do that very much resonate. And then a third thing is we actually involve our members in the decision making around how funds are deployed. And so anytime let's say we have £5,000 in the bank, if we spot an opportunity to fund a project that might cost £3,000, we would actually produce a proposal, and that proposal will explain, why we think it's important to fund this project, what the outcomes might be, what some of the challenges might be, and then we have all our members vote on that proposal. And so, if the majority of members vote that we should, and that proposal, then it would pass, and we would deploy that funding in that way. So we're essentially rethinking the donor experience, which is something that a lot of people don't do. Like you mentioned before, the way to capture donors is to show them these like images, these very like emotionally charged images. What we actually do on the flip side is we create a more engaging, transparent, and interesting donor experience, and hope that is the thing that brings people over.
I wanted to also touch on the fact that you said, so for example, if there's any conflict or humanitarian aid, some traditional charities might like move funds around. So for example, currently in Kenya, there's been like a lot of flood and issues, and a lot of people unfortunately have passed. So what is your kind of rulings, or how does Kwanda work on that? Like, do you guys move or use that money to help with any of that?
Yeah, so we do. So our I'll speak maybe at some point in this podcast about our general approach to funding, but an
Mhm.
exception that we do have um, comes into play when things like this happen, like the flooding in Kenya, where we would do like a very like fast-paced vote and say, hey, we have some cash in the bank. Let's use a proportion of it to like help victims of the flooding in Kenya. And these things are obviously short term and more typical. Um, and so, although like we aim to be helpful in that way because it definitely represents the interests of our members, we do try to stick to our thesis around more the long term impact.
Mm.
And so, yeah, in terms of our policy on that, We do make an exception to our general approach, but mainly we try to stick to long term things because we find that those are the long term projects that aren't like brought about by disaster or anything are the ones that are ultimately going to pay the most dividends going into the future. Um, and also some of the short term response projects typically already are well funded and people raise awareness for them. And the things that are actually neglected are some of the more sustainable long term stuff that people are doing on the ground. So we try to like speak for those type of projects and work.
Okay, okay. So as we kind of this kind of flows quite well to, can you give us an example of like a good Kwanda project or any Kwanda project?
Yeah, so actually there's a brilliant example that relates to what's happening in Kenya right now. So like you mentioned, there's the flooding in Kenya, which is a problem. We're actually we funded a project in Kenya, a community where they've been basically dealing with food insecurity due to low rainfall. The farmers and the locals in that community have limited access to land, and of course, because of the low rainfall, have limited water. And so they've been struggling to grow a wide variety of crops and have typically had to choose one crop that's highly nutritious and stick with that. And so some locals in the community responded to this issue by essentially designing this vertical garden technology. And how it works is you get a mound of soil, you wrap it with netting, and then you puncture the netting, and then you also install like a water hole in the top of the soil. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to plant multiple crops in the sides of the mound and also water from the top down. So it's not over a spread of land, which is less efficient. And then finally, it requires just a limited amount of land because you don't need to create a spread. And so what this has meant is they can actually grow the same amount of crops with less water, even more crops with less land, and then grow a wider variety of crops because then the crops are not like interacting with each other based on the placement. And so we funded the building of 20 of these vertical gardens and also the training of locals to build the gardens themselves. The project has been going on for around 2 months now. It's been highly successful. And in fact, the vertical gardens are producing a surplus and a lot of the locals are taking that surplus to market to earn an additional income. So that's an example of something where, in the future where there is some sort of climate issue like low rainfall, we've already kind of found a solution. And so where, your traditional nonprofits or NGOs might say, hey, let's say in a year, another community has this issue. Traditionally, what would happen is they say, oh, we need to find some food and give it to them for a few months. But we've already kind of counteracted this issue beforehand by investing in this more longer term solution and not waiting to react. So that's a perfect example of the type of stuff we do at the Kwanda and one of the recent things we have done.
So just on this project, how did you find this solution? Like, how does the progress work? Have like the villagers reached out to you, or you found them?
Yeah, so we have two real methods of sourcing projects. One is we proactively like scout for
Okay.
entrepreneurs, change makers doing interesting things across Africa. And two is our villagers would reach out and say, hey, like I have this auntie, she's based in Uganda, and the bishop has this orphanage and does this really interesting work. And then we'd say, okay, that sounds great. Can you make an introduction and we learn a bit more about what they're actually doing? So those are the two methods we use.
Okay, okay. So I think this flows into like money transparency, which I wanted to touch on. So there's kind of money transparency in two ways that I want to talk about. Like one side is kind of like on the customer side, so the people that are giving the charity money for you to do something, but also on the part of the people, the entrepreneurs that are asking Kwanda for a certain amount to do this project. For the villagers, for example, asking Kwanda for a certain amount. So how do you guys work through that? So for example, say I tell you there's this auntie who is doing X, Y, and Z agriculture. for example, the project you just mentioned, how do you guys settle or analyze the pricing, the outcome expectation?
Yeah, so we have some basic criteria, and then we have some more technical criteria that we evaluate projects on. So some of the basic stuff is just, are you based in Africa? Is the project being executed and established in Africa? Are you legally registered or have a fiscal host that can represent you? And then those are just like, hey, to get through the door, these things have to be true. And then we have a few other things, which is, does the person have a track record we can actually look at and expertise in this field? Have they evidenced like clear and timely communication? Do they have a clear plan for how they would use the funds? A whole range of stuff. Have they shown evidence of doing a lot with a little in the past? And so we typically don't fund first time initiatives. It's kind of like we want to see what you're already doing and just give you some capital to scale that up. That's the approach. In terms of due diligence as well, we actually leverage a company called Global Giving, who have quite a robust due diligence process where they would send officers out to these grassroots organizations to basically audit their work. And so they have a database, and we usually reference like organizations that reach out across that database, and we're far more likely to work with them if they're already on that database, meaning they've been due diligence by this third party. And then finally, one final thing we do to mitigate, and there's always risk, like aren't able to completely eliminate risk, is if we're working with a partner or change maker or organization for the first time. So we do a pilot project, and essentially we use that pilot project not only to test, their competence in outputting the solution, but also test the communication, because for us it's very important to be able to feed our members real-time communication. And so that's a nice testing ground. And we've only had one project out of maybe over 15 now where, the pilot fell through, and it wasn't any malpractice or anything. It was just like, hey, like we made a few mistakes trying to execute these projects. We spent the money in the wrong way, and we couldn't kind of get to the end of it.
Mm. So then, how long does a usual project last for?
Yeah, it definitely depends. I mean, if I was to give you an average, I'd say 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
But as we like develop relationships with partners, we are happy to fund longer term projects. And we do have these like almost self-determined longer term projects where we've realized that, hey, there's actually something we've done in the past and there's no reason not to do a lot more of it going on into the future. So an example of that is we've done a lot of work delivering sustainable menstrual kits to girls across Africa. We've done these so far in individual projects where it's like, hey, and we'll do it in Ghana, it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks. We'll do it in Nigeria, it's going to take 2 to 4 weeks, etc. But now we've just established that we should just have a long-term goal to continue doing this sort of work. And so currently one like goal that we have is to deliver sustainable menstrual kits to 1,000 girls. And our timeline for that particular goal is the whole year. And so the components of that goal will be loads of smaller projects. But that's one way you can say, on one hand, there's a smaller project that takes 6 to 8 weeks, but this entire initiative is a year-long one.
Okay. So just on that project, how are you guys keeping it like sustainable? So for example, once you've delivered a menstrual kit one time, what is it
Yeah,
to say that they might not need it more, or like can they now afford to
yeah.
have more?
So the way we're doing that is actually in the way the program is designed. And so I can give an example of a real life project we did in Kenya again, which perfectly illustrates this. So in this particular project, we were delivering these kits to 200 and I think it was 230 girls. And the typical approach again, when you look at traditional approaches, is let's purchase a bunch of single use products in the West and ship it over and just give it to them. And oh, now we can say, we've given 500 girls menstrual kits. What we did instead is we actually funded the employment of local sewers in Kenya. So I think it was about 5 or 6 women. And so they're able to custom like create these sustainable menstrual kits that last for 3 to 4 years. I think it was 2 to 3 years or 3 to 4 years, and size to the girls, etc., because they're all in the same community. And then they distributed the kits to these girls. And so the reason this is sustainable is because one, when the girls run out of the kits or need a new one, they could just go back to those women who live 5 minutes down the road and get another one, as opposed to say, hey, that organization that purchased a bunch of kits
Mm.
from somewhere in Belgium, like I haven't heard back from them. So that's one thing. And the second thing is we actually did funded community workshops and education. And so what happened was kind of the stigma around menstruation was basically reduced in that community. And so a lot of other girls in surrounding communities and also parents, mothers were requesting these kits as well, and then could directly go to these women to just have them made. And so these women essentially were able to spin up a business. And so now we're not currently, we plan to, but we're not currently and haven't invested in that particular community and projects for 1 to 2 years now, I want to say, but these girls are still receiving kits, and probably more girls that we don't track as our own doing have probably received more kits as well.
Okay, so kind of on the second point on money transparency, I wanted to talk about like rather kind of like on a customer side. So like literally I just a quick story. I went on a hike yesterday and it was you needed to raise money for charity. It was literally £150, and I found it so hard to basically get people to donate and just give money. It's quite difficult to try and get money from people,
Mm,
and I think there's a conversation to be had on why, like if I said if you pay £5 you receive this, I feel like people will rather do it than if you pay £5 other people will receive this. I feel like that's a little bit of a pause, and even myself, when I saw Kwanda, now I'm a villager, but it I don't know
yeah,
psychologically. I don't know if it was conscious
yeah,
or
yeah.
unconscious. There was a little bit of a pause, and it's more on like, oh, what they're gonna use with my money, and it's more suspicion. But I probably wouldn't have had that type of suspicion if I just went to a store or paid for a Netflix subscription, which is actually more than what you require monthly, or you know. So, kind of like, how do you guys
Mm.
tackle that kind of issue on money transparency?
Yeah, yeah. So this is actually, one of our biggest challenges. And I'm actually still learning, why don't people, why aren't people like quick to donate and things like this. And I've been asking like different people questions, trying to get at it. But I guess one of the big things, and also is probably a challenge for Kwanda specifically, is lack of urgency. In the sense that if there is an earthquake happening right now, people are far more likely to donate because it's like, oh my god, there's something happening right now. If enough of us get behind it, we can kind of tackle this thing. So I think the promise of someone else benefiting from your money, there is a sense of there's not much urgency. I can get back to this later. Like I think even when you speak about your experience, you know you said if it was a Netflix subscription or something you would pay, and it's because of course you get the value right away. And something that might have actually happened for you is not an I will not pay for charity for a charitable thing, but more I'll do it later kind of thing. And I think that's the decision that most people have, and it's like, I'll do it later. There's always going to be an opportunity to do this thing. There's no immediate value. And so, yeah, I don't know the answer to that just because it's one of the things we're like in the middle of now trying to understand. I think there's different tactics you can use to get people to um, be more likely to pay. Like one is like create a sense of urgency. There's creating a sense of exclusivity. There's building in other benefits. Like we're trying to do that with Kwanda. Like, we've got a community of really smart and charitable people. And so there is enough of us. There's also an additional benefit of having that network. And we have a WhatsApp group where we share opportunities. And so the idea is that, hey, yes, you are giving back, but also you can tap into this like resource that we have in our community. There's making it cool to give. There's getting entertainers involved. There's so many different elements, but I think ultimately you're always going to struggle to get people to be interested in giving charitably just because there isn't like that immediate value that they get back from it.
I think my next question was going to be on some of the challenges that Kwanda faces. Would you say that's kind of like the main one, or do you have other ones as well?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Mm.
Trust in general is just a challenge. in charitable giving and philanthropy in general. So that's one we tackle for sure. And then I think another one is our long-term view on project selection. And so, like I alluded to earlier, it's easy to fund and find organizations that are giving people food or, giving people single-use menstrual kits or giving people like medical checkups for 1 week out of the year. It's harder to fund and find like change makers in organizations that have that longer term view. And so one of our challenges is creating a pipeline of those type of opportunities. So a lot of people might see Kwanda and say, hey, like, why don't you give this village in, I don't know, Burundi a bunch of food? Like you're sitting on 5K and it's like, hey, we're sitting on that because we're going to find like the change maker who makes it that this community will never need to be given food. And then when we find that person, we need to be ready to invest in her or him. So that's definitely a big challenge. It's kind of
Mm,
persuading people to have more of a longer term view
okay.
on impact.
So just on that, does Kwanda ever think of, so for example, the vertical gardens that's happening in Kenya, it works. You guys ever just take something that already works in one country and try and apply it here since you're and do it yourself?
Yeah, so that's the long term plan. So we're basically there. There's a journey towards that, which looks like this. One is, and we've done a good job of moving along that journey quite rapidly. So the first step of the journey is, hey, these local change makers have like an innovation that can help a local problem, and you give them funding to implement that solution. Then we, in collaboration with these local change makers, we take it a step further by having training be a part of that process such that the education to build the solution is disseminated around the community. So now a few things can happen. One is that if the originator of that idea goes away, someone else can pick it up. Another is that that other person can move to another village and have this idea in their head and say, and if that other village or community has that problem, they say, hey, when I used to live in this community, we did this thing. I could do it here. And so that's currently where we are today. Where we want to move to is something that looks like digitizing the training. So you can move it from Kenya to Tanzania very easily, or Kenya to Nigeria, or even across to the Caribbean, for example. So that's the new thing we're trying to figure out. And we think something like AI might help a lot with that. And then the fourth piece that might be on the same level as, this more distributed knowledge approach is going to market. So actually creating a commercial product and saying, hey, this becomes a company. So now we have this vertical garden company and can sell this product into other countries or communities, etc. So that's the long term play. It's how do you go from solution to educating to distributing the education on the solution, and then maybe more globally go into
Okay,
market with
that
the
makes
solution.
sense. That makes sense. Do you have any idea on what you think the future of aid giving or NGOs would be? Do you, because obviously I feel like you've cracked the code and kind of realized that you this is probably like the best way
Mm.
to do it rather than kind of a one time sum where you just give kits and then that's it. Do you think other people might also, do you think there will be a shift in aid giving?
Yeah, I think naturally aid giving or any kind of charitable giving should become more effective just because I believe the world's getting more intelligent. And so it's inevitable that that giving will become more effective and go to the right places. That's more under like kind of technological element. I think on a human element, people are demanding more of NGOs, charities. And I think we're going to play a role in that. Like when someone sees the way Kwanda operates, it will be hard to go back to the old model. And they'll say, hey, is there a reason why I can't see how this project played out in real time? Or is there a reason why I can't know how much funds are currently in this charity's bank account? So I think there will be a higher demand for that. And I think we're seeing that in like millennials and Gen Z who are essentially, I wouldn't even say are breaking away from the old models. They never were onboarded in the old models in the first place. And now they're getting to a place where it's like, you know what, I have some disposable income. What might giving back look like? And how would I want it to look in order for me to be like incentivized to actually do that? I think they will, for that reason, be demanding like more modern vehicles for charitable giving. And I think aid is going to go from top down to bottom up. Once we see a few more success
Mm,
stories around bottom up giving.
okay. Yeah, so I think just one of the last few questions that I had was, on this podcast, we really try and not just talk about certain topics in Africa or just about things that people are doing, but we want to really see, okay, what did we learn from this conversation? What can I apply it to my life? What action points are there? So, for any of the listeners that are listening now who might have never heard of Kwanda or have, and maybe I haven't signed up or anything like that. What is your action point to them?
Yeah, I mean, my action point would be one to check out what we're doing at Kwanda and to consider the role you're playing as someone who can give back in some form, whether that's through skills, etc. I think one thing I try and tell people is that actually it's a privilege to be able to give back and you get something back from that and from knowing that you're contributing to the world beyond just, the job you do, etc. And so a lot of people say, hey, I would like to do philanthropy when I'm rich.
Mm.
And we essentially find those people and try to say, hey, you can start doing it now with a community of 500, 600 others. And that's what we present with Kwanda. So if you are someone who's interested in philanthropic giving, who wants to, re-strengthen your connection with the African continent or the Caribbean and is looking for a means to do that, I think Kwanda is a good place to start.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you have any things that you would like to say that maybe I haven't asked, or any other points that you'd like to raise?
Um, like I think you know, we have to start thinking on 10, 20-year horizons and making decisions from that place. So it's less, what's going to happen in a year from now and how should I respond to that? But actually, what might Africa look like in 20 years? And, what can I do now to shift that trajectory in a more positive direction? And like I said, that's what we're doing with Kwanda. But the idea is for everyone to be doing that. Even when you think about the narrative around Africans in the diaspora,
Yeah,
etc., it's like, what can I start doing to shift that? How can I start changing my language to shift that? How can I start changing the things I pay attention to shift that, etc. So yeah, I would ask people to start thinking about things on the long term and start thinking about, what subtle changes that they can make now that in 10, 20 years will be magnified and create quite a large shift in their benefit.
yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think that's one of the reasons also I wanted to start this podcast is that, you find when there's any big issues or, political issue that's like currently on the news, or it's people quick question is like, what can I do now? But
Mm,
it's unfortunately slightly too late for that to be effective in a kind of like a positive way. So I think the aim of this podcast is really to let's talk about certain things like in advance and see, okay, this is what's happening now. What is the future and what can we actually get to if people just pay a little bit more attention to Africa and just pay a little bit more attention to like what can happen rather than it being like you saw it on the news and you're like, oh, what can I do now? And you had no idea that anything was going on before. And you're kind of like in a rush response, emotional response. Um, but yeah, I think, yeah, just long term is really probably what it is. What is that?
100%.
Okay, thank you so much for joining, and yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think Kwanda's doing an amazing work. I will put all the description links and information in the description below. I know you has a LinkedIn account, really active on there, so I'll post it
Yeah,
in the description account below. Yeah, so if you're not already signed up, do so. Really, really good charity. Okay, thank you.